Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending Series 12 looking at artifacts in the Third Age, I'm spending this series looking at different cultures of men of the Third Age. Now, in week 96, we looked at that difference between high men, middle men, or men of the twilight, and the men of darkness, and took a quick look at the Variags of Khand. Last week, we began our study of the Easterlings, their origins back in the First Age, and the trouble they gave Gondor all the way into the Third Age. This week, we'll take a look at the Easterlings later in the Third Age, beginning around 2500, when Gondor was under the stewardship of Cirion. Now, he had become steward in the year 2489, and we read in Unfinished Tales that the menace from the north was ever in his mind, and he gave much thought to ways that might be devised against the threat of invasion from that quarter, as the strength of Gondor diminished. He put a few men into the old forts to keep watch on the Undeeps, and sent scouts and spies into the lands between Mirkwood and Dagorlad. He was thus soon aware that new and dangerous enemies coming out of the east were steadily drifting in from beyond the Sea of Rhûn. These are, of course, the Easterlings of old, but we'll see a new name for them soon. They were slaying or driving north up the river Running and into the forest the remnant of the Northmen, friends of Gondor that still dwelt east of Mirkwood. But he could do nothing to aid them, and it became more and more dangerous to gather news. Too many of his scouts never returned. It was thus not until the winter of the year 2509 was past that Cirion became aware that a great movement against Gondor was being prepared. Hosts of men were mustering all along the southern eaves of Mirkwood. They were only rudely armed, and had no great number of horses for riding, using horses mainly for draft, since they had many large wains, as had the Wain Riders, to whom they were no doubt akin, that assailed Gondor in the last days of the kings. But what they lacked in gear of war, they made up in numbers, so far as could be guessed. So that's their connection to the Wain Riders, which in turn connects them to the Easterlings of old. It's also a reminder that it's been around 450 years since the end of the kings of Gondor, and close to 550 since the defeat of Ondahare by those same Wain Riders. After this, we learn that Cirion thought about asking help from the Eotheod, but one of his concerns was that any messengers he'd send would have to go through lands already watched and patrolled by the Balchath before they could reach the Vales of Anduin. Now, the footnote to the word Balchath here reads, "So these people were then called in Gondor, a mixed word of popular speech, from Westron Balk, horrible, and Sindarin Hoth, horde, applied to such peoples as the orcs." Remember, the orcs are sometimes referred to as the Glamhoth, which does not mean glamorous horde, though that would be an interesting idea, right? But din horde, or yelling horde. Now, that same Hoth element was used as a pejorative ending instead of the Rim element, hence the Losoth, or snow horde, because they could have been called the Losrim, the snow people. Now, from this moment, as we read about the Balchath, we then follow the story of Cirion and Eorl through to Eorl's arrival to Celebrant, when the northern army of Gondor was in peril. Defeated in the Wold and cut off from the south, it had been driven across the Limelight, and was then suddenly assailed by the orc host that pressed it towards the Anduin. All hope was lost when, unlooked for, the riders came out of the north and broke upon the rear of the enemy. Then the fortunes of battle were reversed, and the enemy was driven with slaughter over Limelight. Eorl led his men in pursuit, and so great was the fear that went before the horsemen of the north that the invaders of the Wold were also thrown into panic, and the riders hunted them over the plains of Calenardhon. But that wasn't the last time we'd see them. It's not like the riders wiped them out. No, in fact, their return in 2545, just 35 years later, led to the death of Eorl, as we read in Appendix A to The Lord of the Rings. Eorl's days were shortened by a renewed attack of the Easterlings. Eorl fell in battle in the Wold, and the first mound was raised. Felaroth was laid there also. Now, his son, Brego, drove the enemy out of the Wold, and Rohan was not attacked again for many years. In fact, it wouldn't be until 2758, more than 200 years later, before the Easterlings would renew their attacks. But their involvement in the War of the Ring is what we know them for. first named by Boromir in the Council of Elrond when he says that Mordor has allied itself with the Easterlings and the cruel Haradrim, who we'll get to next week. Faramir describes both similarly, speaking of the time before Cirion and Eorl, when he explains that they were wise by making a truce with the proud peoples of the north who often had assailed us, men of fierce valor, but our kin from afar off, unlike the wild Easterlings or the cruel Haradrim. And when we get to the Battle of the Pelennor, we learn that the force held back at first, but later sent into battle by Gothmog after the Witch King's apparent death, included Easterlings with axes. In battle with them, after the arrival of Aragorn, we are told the Easterlings were strong and war-hardened and asked for no quarter. Later, as the Lords of the West made their way north through Ithilien to the Black Gate, we read that a strong force of orcs and Easterlings attempted to take their leading companies in an ambush. But, just like the rest of the enemy forces, when Sauron was destroyed, everything changed. The men of Rhûn and of Harad, Easterling and Southron, saw the ruin of their war and the great majesty and glory of the captains of the West. And those that were deepest and longest in evil servitude, hating the West, and yet were men proud and bold, in their turn now gathered themselves for a last stand of desperate battle. But the most part fled eastward as they could, and some cast their weapons down and sued for mercy. Finally, though, there was peace. After Aragorn's coronation, we read that the king pardoned the Easterlings that had given themselves up and sent them away free. Now, that said, it isn't certain the peace lasted very long at all, because in Appendix A about the House of Eorl, we read that Eomer took again the oath of Eorl. Often he fulfilled it, for though Sauron had passed, the hatreds and evils that he bred had not died, and the king of the West had many enemies to subdue before the white tree could grow in peace. And wherever King Elessar went with war, King Eomer went with him, and beyond the sea of Rhûn, and on the far fields of the south, the thunder of the cavalry of the Mark was heard, and the white horse upon green flew in many winds until Eomer grew old. Sounds to me like he is still fighting both the Easterlings and the Haradrim. Folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we continue the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. And please check out patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, and more. Subscribe to the show in your podcast apps or here on the PPP channel on YouTube. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.